Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, you know one of the best things about being a comic book YouTuber is you guys. You know, I've admitted in the past, I'm not super knowledgeable on Spawn, and I'm kind of learning about it as I go through it and I cover it. I covered Spawn issues, the first section, right? So like the origin of Spawn, and then like the second part, and then like the origin of Angela. And then a lot of the guys were just like, no, Rob, like just go with Spawn number 154 and just read forward, right? Like just read Armageddon, basically. Like all you need to know is that Spawn, Malebolgia basically ended up dying. Spawn ended up killing him. He was offered, Malebolgia's place in hell. Spawn said no because he didn't want to be part of hell. He wanted to do his own thing. That's all you need to really worry about, right? Just cover Armageddon. I promise you will not be disappointed. Man, let me tell you something. Dude, this story is lit. It's amazing. This is why I'm so glad I have you guys, right? Like, this is why I'm so glad that I have you guys. So you guys, like, when it comes to stuff that I'm not really familiar with, you guys can be like, no, Rob, go read this instead. So here's the thing. Give me suggestions on like Spawn and like other stories and other things that are not Marvel and DC. Give me suggestions about that kind of stuff because you guys seem to love it and I'd love to go check those things out, right? Like, I'm mostly just a Marvel DC guy, right? Like, I don't really dip my toe out of the waters, but nonetheless, you guys don't care about my stance on comics. You guys are here for Spawn's war against heaven and hell. Okay, there are a couple things to know going into this, right? We already covered one of them, that essentially Malebolgia is no longer part of the picture, right? Like he was killed in Spawn issue number 100, and in his place came a guy named Lord Mammon, I think is what his name was. Now Mammon is one of the fallen ones, and this will kind of be explained a little more as we get through this, but the long and short of this is that when it came to the fallen ones in the Spawn universe, and I do not know how true this is to actual biblical storytelling, but the idea was that when the war between heaven and hell broke out, that there were angels who supported God but chose not to fight. And the result is that they were basically cast out of heaven, but never actually sent to hell. Mammon seems to be the exception, right? He's one of the rulers of hell, and he's more powerful than Malebolgia is. The other part of this is there's what's called the Man of Miracles, and then there's Sam and Twitch. Now, Sam and Twitch are really kind of like the sidekicks of Spawn, not in the sense of like Robin or anything like that, Robin for Batman, but insofar as like they're supporting characters in the story. But Sam and Twitch in the 1990s were huge. People loved Sam and Twitch, right? Like they loved like the bickering that went on between the two of them and that kind of thing. So eventually they spun out into their own series, which was hugely popular, I'm pretty sure. I think it was like a massively popular series, but people loved Sam and Twitch. The idea is that they're kind of detectives, right? So they basically help Spawn out insofar as there are things going on out there and it's like, okay, Spawn can't really figure it out on his own, or they can provide him with information he couldn't readily get on his own, different things like that. Now the Man of Miracles is ambiguous. If you know who he is, please do not tell anyone, right? I know who the Man of Miracles is. We find out, but please do not tell anyone who the Man of Miracles is. But one of the first big instances of the Man of Miracles encountering Spawn was when he basically removed the kid named Chris. And the idea behind this is that Chris was essentially seemed to be some aspect of Spawn himself that could basically reach in and grab other personalities out of Spawn. Now, why he has those personalities and how he got them will be explained over the course of this video. But what we do here is really kind of jump into the meat and potatoes, right? Because you guys want to kind of get into this sort of thing. And one of the things Spawn establishes right off the bat is he is not an agent of heaven and he's not an agent of hell, right? He's not working with either force. And that's what makes things kind of interesting, is because Todd McFarlane depicts the conflict between heaven and hell almost as like rival gangs. Each one's trying to take over the other's turf, right? Like the angels and heaven want to get rid of like the forces of evil, and the forces of evil want to get rid of like heaven and all the angels and God and all that kind of stuff, And so they're sort of always warring against each other. Spawn, after the death of Malebolgia and the power that he possessed following that, basically put him in a position to where both sides were jockeying to get him to their side, right? Because of the power he possesses and what it is that he can do. And so because of that, he's kind of like, I don't want to have anything to do with this anymore, right? Like, I'm doing my own thing. I'm not fighting for either side. And so the result of this is that he's basically given, in an attempt to essentially stop the apocalypse, stop the end times from coming, he's giving these kind of locations by Sam and Twitch about things that are popping off. Now, what they say is most of these skirmishes are being dealt with by like local police, but there are some that are exceedingly bad and things are kind of going nuts. And so the result of this is we end up jumping to basically Joshua Creek, Tennessee. What we have here are essentially the dead rising to life, right? The dead coming back and then just, not really resuming their lives the way they did, but like kind of maintaining their personalities, different things along those lines. But this is really one of those instances where it really does look like the apocalypse. And so with Spawn arriving on the scene, we pick up with this guy named Hiroshi Kitamura. And this guy's we're not really given a lot of story here. All we know is that somewhere along the line that this guy basically died. In addition to him, there's also a young woman that's brought along as well by the name of Kumiko. Now, for the most part, all they've known is darkness for a pretty lengthy amount of time. And for the most part, they were seemingly yanked out of the body of Spawn by Christopher himself. And so the result is that he basically tells these two guys, you all are going to be endowed with some measure of power. You guys are here to help me, essentially quell this threat, right? These undead zombies that are running around this city. And so it's kind of interesting because Kumiko is more or less obsessed with video games. And her grandfather is a lot more traditional insofar as he's kind of like the slow moving guy, right? Like analyze the situation, figure out what's going on, don't just rush in head on. Whereas Kumiko just grabs some guns and just starts shooting the place up. And the reason why is because for her, she used to play this game that really had her just like wiping out zombies in a game called Zombie Wipeout. And so she got really good at killing zombies. And so it's kind of like her thing, right? It's her repertoire. Now there's a reason for why it was that she was chosen here along with her grandfather. But once they get in here, they immediately just start kind of unloading, right? You have her grandfather who's just tearing everything up, at least slicing heads off and so on. And you've got Kumiko, shooting everything up that she possibly can. And things are kind of popping off pretty quickly. The issue with this is that as the situation begins to unfold and as they begin to really take on their true forms, because this has all happened within the span of minutes, right? So their bodies are still transforming from how they look when they first pop up to when they really start to gain these powers and more or less become their spawn selves, more or less, or spawn versions for lack of a better word. But Kumiko is of course surrounded by zombies and then she's ultimately saved by her grandfather. And then once they get inside this place, this preacher who had essentially called all these people together and who was saying, hey guys, all we have to do is pray, everything will be fine. Then ultimately they're of course being consumed by zombies. Now for the Spawn series being as religious as it is, the fact that God's not answering their prayers is a big hint to what's going on. But we'll find out what it is that's taking place here in a second. But it's one of these things where with these characters being essentially brand new and us not really getting a lot of them aside from the fact that they're killing zombies and kind of going on a warpath, that's when she begins to realize the reason why they're beginning to look the way they do, kind of decayed, breaking down, things like that, is because they are in fact dead. And that's when the grandfather realizes, I'm the one who killed her, right? He killed his own granddaughter. That kind of seems to have been the case. That's where things are sort of popping off here. We end up learning there's a handful of things that are going on. The first is that humanity is crying out for God to save them, right? This place, Joshua, Tennessee, Joshua Creek, is not the only place where things are going wild. It seems to be the only place where the dead are rising, but it's not the only place where people are sort of panicking and looking to God to save them from whatever it is that's taking place. That essentially God is not answering anybody's prayers, that heaven itself is under siege. But the reason why God's not answering anybody's prayers is because God is not there. The throne of heaven is empty. No one knows where God is. And so what we do here is we pick up with essentially the angels of heaven, right? These warrior angels. Now, you guys will probably remember them from our origin on Angela. We didn't really touch too much on them after that. And in reality, what you learned in that video is really all you need insofar as they are the individuals who are charged with protecting heaven against whatever invaders would come to its doorstep, namely the forces of hell. But the fact that the forces of hell are so huge in number and the forces of heaven are dwindling so fast really all points to the idea that the forces of hell are going to win out, right? Everybody in heaven is essentially going to die at some point. Hence the reason why the character of Zera has basically been resurrected. Now, the way in which her character plays out is really cool, right? What we end up learning here is that somewhere along the line, Zera was an agent of heaven and was really considered to be God's most loyal servant. She had a bloodlust that was really unchallenged. Nobody was on the same level as she was when it came to destroying enemies, right? She's an exceedingly powerful member of the heavenly pantheon. The issue with this is that once her bloodlust takes over, it's like Thor in his warrior's madness. All reason and logic go out the window, and all she wants to do is just destroy everything. And so because of the fact that she was kind of considered to be this sort of chaotic concept insofar as her being sent out into the field and then killing these various forces would require God to monitor her all the time and then eventually reel her back because she wasn't really in control of herself. Ultimately, this basically led to God imprisoning her from the time that he sort of began to realize that she was uncontrollable, essentially up until now when she's been freed. Now this kind of begs the question, why didn't God just fix her so she could be controlled? I don't know, probably for the sake of the story. But regardless, her rage manifests in the form of this giant beast of war. But it's this idea that the angels of heaven really look at her and say, with her being on the battlefield now, the tide has turned because she's more than enough to take out all these forces, these members of the forgotten of Lord Mammon, who are all basically trying to lay siege to the gates of heaven. And so following that, what we end up doing is basically picking up to, all these individuals who have been more or less massacred by the Hindu goddess Kali. At least I believe it's Hindu. The way it's kind of depicted here, that sort of seems to be the case. But before we jump into that, what we end up doing is picking up with the man of miracles. And And the Man of Miracles essentially visits Spawn. And it's kind of interesting because a Man of Miracles will sort of make these appearances here and there. And now again, if you know who the Man of Miracles is, please do not spoil anything. We will find out in the next video. But the Man of Miracles basically says that like there really isn't going to be a way for you to stop this. You can if you want to, but at the end of the day, you're going to need Christopher to make this happen, right? Like talk to Chris, he will know what to do. And so again, things are kind of ambiguous here. There's a lot of questions popping up that we don't really get definitive answers to, but we will, so do not worry, right? So the next thing that we end up doing is basically, you know, having Christopher travel back into Spawn and then sort of end up in this giant desert plain with these two individuals. And what we end up finding out here is that the man's name is Amal and the woman's name is Shanti. And they've basically kind of existed here and they sort of recognize where they are to a degree insofar as they seem to basically be part of Spawn, but it's also this idea that their karma is more or less tainted, right? And I don't know if it's really tainted in the traditional sense insofar as like they did bad things to people, but it's this idea that they cannot truly cross over. And the reason why is that for them, they're still holding on to this kind of earthly presence, right? This thing that still binds them to the earth as it exists now. And the reason why is because once they're yanked out and they start having this conversation with Spawn, what they say is according to their belief system, they follow something called the Book of Vedas, right? This book that really gives people a kind of direction, a sort of compass when it comes to wisdom and the things that they can read that essentially contains the legends of the gods. That in the religion itself, that it follows a process whereby they die and they're reborn multiple times in an effort to basically achieve nirvana, to essentially achieve spiritual perfection. And that according to these legends, that Kali was created out of pure light to battle the forces of Mahishasura, I think it is. I apologize if I've mispronounced that, but basically to battle his forces of darkness. The issue with this is that as Kali began to battle these forces, she began to become corrupted by her bloodlust, right? This idea of just eventually destroying and killing everything. And so in response to that, her husband Shiva essentially laid himself down among the dead, and then she came to believe that she had essentially killed him. And so in that moment, she had basically sort of experienced a kind of sympathy, right? A kind of pain for what it was that she had done. But ultimately, this whole thing is just more or less a myth, is how they refer to it, that it's really an allegory. It's not designed to be taken literally. It's just designed to show how easy it is, one, when it comes to the forces of good and evil, to how easy it is to fall to the evil side, right? How easy it is to stray from the path of righteousness, more or less, and become the worst version of themselves. Now, this is where things sort of shift, because what or I guess not really Todd McFarlane, it's David Hine who writes this, but what he ends up doing is like shifting the whole thing on his head and saying, no, Kali is very much real. The other part of this is that Kali's really depicted as being on a pantheon of power, while not necessarily tied directly into heaven and hell, into Judeo-Christianity. She appears to be on a level of power that's higher than that of Spawn, right? This is all kind of stated by way of the fact that Spawn doesn't immediately get into a conflict with her and kill her, but also kind of, you know, things like, I could destroy you easily if I wanted to, right? I could annihilate you in your entirety if I wanted to, right? So that kind of seems to be the case, that in reality, she's just that much more powerful than Spawn himself. And so following this, you end up getting this interesting sort of situation, right? Where Spawn kind of rehashes what is it he's doing when he basically says, I'm here to prevent the apocalypse. And she's like, well, you can't prevent that. Why would you try? You're a hell Spawn. You're supposed to fight on the sides of good or evil. Really on the side of evil, that's your purpose. And his response is, well, I choose who I fight for. Now this is kind of cool, because what it shows is that even though Kali's not really part of Judeo-Christianity, it's all something everybody is aware of, right? So it's very similar to Marvel in that regard, right? Insofar as you have like the Sky Fathers, right? You've got Odin, you've got Zeus, all that kind of stuff. They're aware of who they are, right? So it's just this great big huge sort of shared space. And that's kind of a cool thing to see, right? It's interesting. It kind of changes the way that you see the story to a degree. But the long and short of it is that essentially you end up having this deal that's kind of being struck. That Shanti and her husband really say, like, basically Kali says, I will leave this place and I will spare Spawn if you're willing to give up that which you value most, that which means the most to you. And the result is that we kind of learn their origin story. And what we end up finding out is that somewhere along the line, that Shanti and her husband were basically expecting, right? She was pregnant with a child. And that as they were making their way to their parents' house, they ended up going around this mountainside, this bend, and there was the road was too thin really for them to avoid a truck that was coming around. The result was that they were knocked off the side of the mountain and they ended up dying. And so when they present the child to Kali, the response of Kali is, well, this child's neither alive nor dead, right? This child is reborn from whatever its life was before. But the fact that it hasn't been born means it hasn't left its previous life, but it has not started its new life. It's just kind of stuck there in a state of limbo. And while the parents realize this, at the end of the day, it's their child and they just don't really have the heart to let it go. But because of the fact that there are much bigger things at play here, and because achieving their ability to move beyond their current forms and potentially pass on and even reach nirvana, they end up giving up their child. They end up sacrificing their child to Kali, who basically says, I'm giving this child the gift of death, therefore it can be reborn again in whatever form it's going to take. And so satisfying this bargain, Kali basically leaves. Kali walks away and allows Spawn to continue on his journey. Now, this is where things really begin to pop off. This is where things really begin to get nuts. And the reason why is because what we do here is we pick up, well, we can kind of cover the origin story of Kimiko, right? So the origin story of her and her grandfather, for those of you guys who were interested, the origin story here is that when they were alive, basically, they were of course alive in the modern era. But the grandfather was very much beholden to Japanese tradition, right? Or at least that seems to be the case, right? He talks about Bushido cultures, but the tradition of respecting oneself and the people around them that all went into it. His children were a little more progressive insofar as they considered the beliefs and the teachings of their father to be old hat. And then you had Kimiko, who was even more progressive than that. And as far as she was concerned, she didn't really care about the traditions of her grandfather, and she was at that rebellious age where she was like, I just want to go and do my own thing. My parents just won't understand me, that kind of situation. And so as a result of that, we end up finding out that her grandfather had actually been following her for a few weeks whenever she left the house. And he had considered what she'd done to kind of be disrespectful, but more so than that, he basically wanted to save her. That what he had discovered is that in her private life, that she had basically been going to like nightclubs, bars, different things like that she'd been going and engaging in drugs. She'd been prostituting herself to pay for drugs. And so she was living this pretty horrible lifestyle. And so traveling to essentially this drug den in order to save her, what he ends up doing is, of course, showing up there with a samurai sword. He in turn, kills the guy who answers the door, and then everybody else starts opening fire, right? And so ultimately Kimiko jumps in the way to save the life of her grandfather, and then her grandfather perishes as well. But that's how all this went down, right? It's pretty violent and pretty extreme, but that's how all of this ended up going down. But the real meat and potatoes of this, and really the most important thing, comes with the twins, Jake and Katie, of Terry and Wanda Fitzgerald. Now, for those of you guys who are not super familiar with this, and this is why I think covering the origin story was so important, after Al Simmons was killed, and then he was basically resurrected as Spawn, during that, 5-year or 8-year time period, before he ended up returning, that Wanda believed he was actually dead. And so believing that he was dead, she married his friend, right? Married his best friend because he was there for her when she needed him, that kind of a thing. And so while Cyan is the daughter of Wanda and Al Simmons, Jake and Katie are the children of Terry and Wanda themselves. The issue with this is that following their birth, they've been displaying these almost kind of psychotic tendencies, right? Like wanting to destroy things, different things like that. They've been putting magnets on the fridge and it said stuff like kill mommy, things along those lines. And so Wanda ends up coming home after the babysitter's keeping an eye on the kids. And then essentially you have Katie, who bashed in the head of Jake with a baseball bat, smashed his head in. And Wanda immediately starts to freak out. But the crazy thing is that in the midst of all that, Jake basically gets up, right? And his head starts to heal. Everything starts to go back to normal. And Wanda has no idea what to make of it all. But while that was happening, when Jake was unconscious, she had called the cops and basically said, I think my child is dead, and that kind of a thing. And it all just sort of went nuts after that. When the cops show up, as far as they're concerned, Jake's got a scratch on his head. And the explanation is, well, Jake seems to have fallen and bumped his head. That's how they assume things went down. But of course, Wanda tries to explain everything to Terry that something's wrong. Their kids are not their kids. Something's not right? Things just aren't making sense. That they've always kind of displayed these crazy tendencies, and it's really becoming more than Wanda has been able to handle. And so all this basically comes to a head when you end up having the twins who basically grab a knife and they end up tying up Wanda along with Cyan, and then just kind of stick them in there, right? I mean, they've got the dad tied up, so Terry's tied up. They're all basically tied up, and the twins look like they have a gun. Things are about to pop off, right? Things are about to get kind of nuts. So they seem to have kind of lost their minds. At the very least, Terry's starting to see what it is that Wanda's been talking about their kids being crazy this entire time. And so following this, we switch back over to Zara, and Zara did exactly what she was expected to do, which was basically just lay waste to the forces of the Forgotten and essentially destroy them all. And so ultimately, because all the Forgotten are believed to have been destroyed, she asks them, how does it feel to be the last one left? Are there any more of you? And before this person gives the name, she snaps the guy's neck. And so as a result of that, you end up basically having the other angels who were there kind of watching everything unfold, and it's okay, this is kind of nuts, but what do we sort of do here? And basically it's this notion of her basically saying we're going to initiate the rapture. With heaven's forces being depleted, we're going to recall all those from earth who were faithful to God. And when the response is, but only God can initiate the rapture and God's not here, we don't know where he's at, then Zara's response is, then I'm going to go find him. I'm going to go find God. The next time you see me, God will be at my side. And so what you end up having here is you basically end up having Callie, kind of picking up with her character, only for Callie to basically transform back into the Man of Miracles, right? So that kind of seems to have been the case, that the Man of Miracles essentially went to go test Spawn, or whatever the case is. We don't really know what the reason behind this is, but he's kind of musing to himself about everything that's going on, and says there's truth behind all of these charades. Everything that's going on from the time that Al Simmons became Spawn up until now has all been part of a plan, more or less. It's all been part of a greater plan. That's what he's hinting at, and saying there's truth behind all of this. But only one can set everyone free. A child will save everyone. And that's when we're basically given this kind of perception of what basically ends up looking like Cyan. And so that's where things sort of go nuts, because what we do here is we end up picking up directly with Spawn and his guys, who are just kind of having this conversation. And what we end up getting is this explanation of why Spawn had people inside of him. When you have Spawn and you have Sam and Twitch and Christopher and all these guys all having this conversation, what we end up learning is that when Al Simmons died, that essentially around 6,000 other people all died within the same hour. And for whatever reason, that those 6,000 other people were all bonded to Spawn. But this is the reason why it is that where Spawn didn't know that they were there back in the early days, that Malboja could not control Spawn. He could not make Spawn do whatever it is that he wanted to do. That Malboja was trying to control 6,000 people and not realizing that. And that kind of seems to have been part of the plan that the Man of Miracles was talking about, although we're not entirely sure. Now, as far as Sam and Twitch go with their investigations, only about 2,000 names have been found. But what this means is that Spawn is armed with all these individuals who can essentially help him along this path in his war against heaven and hell. And so that's when things kind of get interesting, because from there, you basically switch back over to Wanda, and you switch back over to Cyan, and you switch back over to Terry and all these guys. And you have the kids who are just like, okay, so let's kill him. Let's do our thing. I mean, why not? Just kind of giving in to their darker and twisted selves. And so where things start popping off, and it's this idea that they're just gonna kill him and they're gonna take these guys out, suddenly Spawn pops up. And when he does, it's kind of like, okay, so essentially saving, Wanda and Terry from Jake and Katie and Cyan, who looks like she's basically on her deathbed, more or less, looks like she's about to die, seeming like he's going to save them. The issue with this is that when he goes to kill Jake and Katie under this idea that what Wanda's telling him is true, that they're not really their children, they're possessed by something, or something's got them screwed up, possessed by demons, whatever the case is, who knows. The Spawn goes to try to take them out, and they cannot die. Initially it's believed that they did. The chains pierce them, they come crashing down, Terry starts freaking out, calls him a murderer, and believes that they're dead, but ultimately they're not, right? They end up getting back up again. And then suddenly there's this huge kind of rattling sound, and literally Zara just comes smashing into the building. And when it's just like, who in the heck are you, right? When Jake responds like, who in the hell are you? Then Zara immediately bends down and says, I am your faithful servant. And it's like, who in the heck is she? And basically Katie says, yes, now I remember who I am, and Jake stands up and says, I do too. My name is not Jake. What this all points to is the idea that the son, the son of Wanda and Terry is none other than God himself. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Man, this story is amazing. And I will catch you all later. Peace. I want to say thank you to all of the new patrons who have joined patreon.com/comicsexplained. I want to give a shout out to Henry, Young Typhon, Elias G, David JS, Jacob H, Ben, John H, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, James O, Chris T, Matt N, Jeff R, Joey M, Stephen Z, Sloth Like Lou, David C, John H, Lean and Mean. That guy asks questions all the time. Adam K, Genosis 916. I want to say thank you to all of you all. This list is growing all the time. Thank you for joining the Patreon.